Okay, hello, welcome everybody to the Telecoms User Group, Birds of a Feather, and Kickoff meeting. So I'm Cheryl Hung, I'm the Director of Ecosystem at the CNCF, and I run the end user community. So this group is a little bit different because we've decided that vendors are very explicitly encouraged to join this group. So I'd like to start off by asking people to raise their hands if you are at a telco operator.
Wow.
About a third, I think. And then if you're from a vendor. Okay. Two-thirds.
50-50. And anyone else?
Does anyone want to shout out any names of the companies that they're from? Lusa, Telstra, Juniper? T-Mobile? Oh, okay. NTT, okay. Vodafone? Ericsson, blah, blah. Okay, Ericsson, okay. I think we've got a good spread here. So the purpose of this group is to collaborate the purpose of this meeting, why we're in this room, is to figure out what are the things that we should focus on in the next 3 to 6 months together. So we have a mailing list and a GitHub repo where we'll collaborate. And after this meeting, I will be running the twice monthly calls that we'll have as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Dan, and Dan can proceed.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cheryl. So my name's Dan Kohn. I'm Executive Director of CNCF. I'll let him fix this. Really want to thank everybody. Should I unplug and replug? Okay. Thank everyone for coming out for this. It's actually an extraordinary turnout for our kickoff meeting. And I think our main objective today is to talk about what are the things that we could deliver in the next 3 to 6 months that would keep a large number of you and many of your colleagues coming back to this and finding that it's useful. There's a convening function that organizations like CNCF can play that's very valuable, but if we don't actually start producing some useful work product and show over time how we're adding value, then everybody's busy and gets distracted and we're not going to keep coming back. Of course nope, just give it a minute more. Okay, so I'm at least going to read a few of these pieces and then I'll come back to you on it. So CNCF, there we go, okay. So just a couple reminders here. We do have a GitHub repo that's actually under CNCF, and Gergely generously is taking some notes. So we'll be posting those as well. I do encourage you to subscribe to this mailing list, and so we'll then be getting in the habit of twice-a-month calls going forward. And I think folks are, on our third day of our event, are familiar with CNCF. I do want to mention that we are working closely with the sister organization in the Linux Foundation, LF Networking, of which many of I think most of the folks in the room are already members, and so we really do see this as important for collaboration. We're going to have another kickoff meeting in Shanghai in 1 month at KubeCon, where there's a ton of interest in this from Huawei and China Mobile and China Unicom and others. And then I think we'll have some sort of BoF or event in Antwerp for the Open Networking Summit Europe. That's in September. And then we'll have another meeting at KubeCon San Diego. But hopefully by then we'll have actually moved much farther along. So as Cheryl mentioned, we're like the end user community, except there we don't have vendors participate. Here, you're very welcome. I do want to make this point that this is not a group to do software development. So CNCF now has 32 projects in it. There's a number of other very valuable open source projects in LF networking or that are controlled by individual companies, and lots of great software development can and does occur there.
Pause for a second, Dan. Would people mind sitting inwards a bit? Because there's a lot of people standing around the edge who can take seats.
Yeah. Thanks, Cheryl.
Come in. Thanks.
Oh, that's very nice. We appreciate you doing that so everybody can be comfortable. But we do think there's a ton of value in terms of writing up requirements, gap analysis, best practices, those kinds of documents, and then working with the upstream communities in order to fulfill that. We had an open networking summit in San Jose a month and a half ago, and there was a little bit of a debate or question around, are cloud native technologies suitable for telecoms in general, or do they need to be adapted? And Chris Wright of Red Hat made the argument that telecom is not as special as it thinks it is, and that actually can fit into the cloud native paradigm extremely well. I thoroughly disagreed with him and said that telecom is special, just like every other industry is special too. That I believe in a world where every child can be above average. But that said, all of these special industries really should be able to collaborate together and share requirements and ideally share infrastructure. And so I think the goal here is to look at those degrees of specialness. This is probably a particularly important slide. I do want to say this deck itself will be linked from Sketch, is on the website, so it's publicly available, and it's easier because all of these are links. But this is my sort of first guess at all of the projects in the CNCF ecosystem that I think are or may be of interest to this group. So Kubernetes Federation V2 has been, it's actually been renamed to KubeFed now, which I think is kind of clever. But it is definitely an important approach if you look at a scenario where there could be thousands or tens of thousands of edge devices, each potentially representing its own Kubernetes cluster, and then trying to have those orchestrated and synchronized at a higher level. Helm as a package manager, customized is another option for dealing with that. Envoy is maybe our fastest growing project and even faster than Kubernetes in some way as a service proxy and connecting these together. The CNF testbed, which we will go through in a little bit more detail, and Taylor is the primary person behind. Open policy agent as a way of enforcing policy, which matters a ton to telecom companies. We have the observability tools, and this is already, so Prometheus, Fluentd, Jaeger, and then you saw today there's the new project OpenTelemetry, the combination of open tracing and open census. Service meshes, Linkerd, which is a CNCF project, Istio, which is not, and so I do want to highlight that fact that there's a lot of interest in it, but it's not hosted by CNCF. Network service mesh, so Ed Warnicki is in the back here. I do need to emphasize it's a sandbox project, which is another way of saying not fully baked yet, but extremely promising for providing, the simplest summary that I've heard is that it's Envoy-like service proxy and routing, but for layer 2 and layer 3 rather than Envoy and Istio, which are at layer 7. Operators is a huge level of interest, obviously a little overloaded term, but looking at how you can automate a huge amount of intelligence on day 2 operations around things like databases and stateful workloads and such. Kubernetes has an IoT Edge working group. I'd say that they're kind of just getting started right now, but that's another area for collaboration. And then this last one is just a link that I thought was quite interesting. I actually forget which company had done this, but they'd come up with a quite clever approach of using Kubernetes as an inventory manager. It's New Relic. And it's just an example of, in general, of using custom resource definitions to build in a ton of additional functionality on top of Kubernetes, as opposed to needing an entirely different platform. So these are the kinds of efforts that we want to follow. I suspect if we chatted more, this audience could suggest another dozen or so, particularly ones not hosted by CNCF that might be possible solutions. Okay, so work items, and this is the kind of area that I'm hoping that we can achieve some consensus on even by the end of this hour. Gap analysis is a huge one of what is feasible today for running network functions on top of Kubernetes and what's not. Another big one is how to connect together existing virtual network functions with cloud native functions, CNFs, running on top of Kubernetes. And I think the three sort of most likely solutions today are Multis, DANM, and Network Service Mesh. But again, I'm also very open to other ones. This cloud native best practices, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on in the slides, and also CNF best practices. And then I do want to make this pitch for the CNF testbed. And our hope here is that this, we can avoid long email chains of people explaining why their technology works better and is the better choice or deserves to be standardized or such, and that instead we could actually be using the CNF testbed for people to implement different approaches in code that anyone can replicate and just see those benefits. Okay, so I think folks might have seen this chart from previous iterations. I do want to, this is particularly in the context of ONAP, which is the major project of our sister organization, LF Networking. But it does speak to the evolution that we see in telecoms. So the very first version of ONAP supports virtual network functions, and the orchestrator could run on OpenStack, VMware, Azure, or Rackspace. And then these two run on top of bare metal. More recently with Casablanca, you can run OpenStack or Kubernetes. Kubernetes can run on top of bare metal or any cloud. You have VNFs. In principle, you could run CNFs on Kubernetes. I don't think a ton of people are doing that today. And then the ONAP orchestrator we're demoing on top of Kubernetes. The future that I think we're talking about here is to have Kubernetes as a universal abstraction layer and platform sitting on top of bare metal or any cloud, that the majority of the network functions can be CNFs, and that your operating support system and business support systems can run on that same Kubernetes cluster, so that you get the bin packing efficiencies and the cost efficiencies of doing so. And then there's a question of a huge number of legacy virtual network functions that may not be cost effective to port over to BCNFs, and looking at abstraction layers of KubeVirt from Red Hat, Vertlet from Mirantis, and then also potentially using OpenStack as that abstraction layer, and then potentially ONAP orchestrating how those network functions are interconnecting. So this is obviously an opinionated diagram. I don't think that this working group needs to adopt this necessarily, but we're definitely open to feedback on it. I do particularly like this phrasing. Brian Grant, who's a co-chair of SIG Architecture, has been doing a series of tweets. He has another one this morning that's quite good, which is his perspective on Kubernetes architecture. And it's a little abstract, but I really do like this summary of an unbounded number of independent asynchronous control loops reading and writing from to a resource store as the source of truth. So, and that it's proven to be resilient, evolvable, and extensible. And I will say that as a distributed systems engineering concept, it is genuinely different than how most, I'd say, all telecom systems are run today, and also quite different from ONAP or other platforms. And I think it's an approach that's already proven itself to a large degree in cloud computing and enterprise software, and has a huge potential in telecom, which is, I think, why we're all here. The evolution will be extremely slow. So we have these physical network functions, basically boxes of routers or firewalls or other kinds of things. And a lot of those have been ported to virtual machines, VNFs, virtual network functions. And those are going to be with us for at least another decade. This is, telecom is necessarily a slow-moving industry in some ways because so much depends on it. So the only approach that makes sense is one that can show an evolution. It's just not possible to ever do a clean sheet rewrite. And that actually mirrors what's happening with enterprises right now, where there's no enterprise of any size that's actually shifted all of their workloads over to Kubernetes. All of them are in process, and some of them are right at the beginning of the journey, some of them are finishing it up. but it's a whole process of moving from monoliths. So the key thing that I would emphasize as we think about that journey is that each step along the way needs to make business sense for the telecom operators. That it's not enough to just say, oh, if you go invest all of this money over the next several years, then eventually it's going to be more efficient for you, or you'll get bin packing efficiencies, or you'll be able to innovate faster. At each step, there should be incremental gains, resiliency, bin packing, development velocity, et cetera, as more and more of those network functions become cloud native. Okay, so that's sort of one big picture idea. I have two more short sections here. I'm going to try and finish up in just the next 5 or 10 minutes. And then I'd love to start getting some reactions, and we can actually do most of the rest of the meeting in an interactive format. So this is somewhat of a thought experiment, but also a pretty practical one, which is picture a 15-year-old firewall that started out as a physical box and then got ported into a virtual machine. And when that happened, very little actually needed to change. It could have all sorts of kernel hacks in it. It could have kernel loadable modules. It could have a lot of very ugly things that made it work. Now, because the operators are saying we want to go cloud native, that vendor is saying, okay, we're going to take our firewall, our VNF, and we're going to port it over to become a cloud native network function, or CNF. So it can no longer have kernel hacks. It can no longer have loadable modules. It needs to support, in principle, any Linux kernel 3.10 or higher. But by no means is it the case that this is now this really optimal system. And so I'm calling it bronze CNFs here, but it's been suggested that I should call it iron or tin or something even more negative. And so this is a very classic lift and shift. So after this is done and you have this firewall CNF, it's quite possible that in order to configure it, you actually need, say, a Windows application using a completely proprietary management interface. It may be saving all of its state to the local disk in a totally proprietary, opaque format. There may be no support for horizontal scalability of moving across multiple machines. There may be no support for vertical scalability of supporting larger or smaller machines. No way to sort of independently configure it. And then it could have a completely proprietary installer rather than having a more standardized version. So in some ways, that's kind of the worst case for a CNF. And I mean, I think you could genuinely argue, what's the point? That have you actually added any value here? Now we can go to the other extreme, and I really do want to emphasize that this is my very rough interpretation of this, and that I do see it as the job of the working group to lay out what really represents best practices. But if you come up with the concept of a gold cloud native network function, those would include ideas like working with any certified Kubernetes implementation as opposed to just a single vendor's, that the networking, it shouldn't rely on a single version, any CNI compatible network that meets the functionality requirements. It should be stateless. So it should store its state either in the Kubernetes API or in some sort of standardized database, and that will give it the horizontal and the vertical scalability in terms of the scaling. Security, it should run unprivileged. On configuration and lifecycle, it should have a declarative interface. It should be configurable using the kind of Kubernetes primitives. And then observability is a huge aspect of this. So open metrics compatible so that you could use Prometheus or compatible proprietary platforms in order to fetch data from it. It should support open telemetry style tracing, Fluentd compatible logging. If it requires specific hardware like a GPU or custom kind of NICs and such, it should manage all of that via the device plugin framework, not via some sort of proprietary system. And then it should be installable and upgradable. And so there's this whole concept of lifecycle management. And so I'm certain this is not the correct list, but it's the example of the kinds of things that one would want to see in an idealized CNF. And I mean, I'm very well aware that these are hard, and it's particularly hard to take an existing 15-year-old system and evolve it to this state. It is feasible. I mean, there's a lot of examples of people refactoring it. But I think one of the key questions is, if we've now defined the two extremes of bronze and gold, what is a silver CNF? What is kind of a good enough that it's generating meaningful economic value for the operators to switch to? And I think that's a little bit up in the air. But you can imagine a scenario where operators would say, okay, the CNFs that we're going to purchase or specify in an RFP need to be silver or higher. You could also imagine that different operators would have different requirements. And so it would be more useful for this work group to come up with a dozen or more different categories and talk about what the spectrum is from not so great to extremely good. Okay, so that is, I think, a whole section of possible output that this working group could focus on, talking about best practices that I think would be valuable, even just having a common vocabulary and terminology that we could refer to. And then I think I'm going to skip over this. I may come back to it, but there's a lot of innovation happening right now in networking. There's a lot of the sort of missing pieces are now reaching maturity on Kubernetes. So Kubernetes has very strong IPv6 support. The dual stack is moving along and getting close. On security, there's this question of, oh, well, are containers secure? I think we have a good number of background here. And again, I'd really recommend that you download this slide decks to be able to click on the links about things like PCI, HIPAA, ISO 27001. And then I do think a lot of the best practices from other industries are just as valid here, but we could also be writing up some more of things to do. I'm going to skip the micro VM piece. So then the last area that I want to talk about is the CNF testbed. And this is a project that CNCF has been organizing over the last 9 months or so. I think I would say that it was a much more painful process than we thought it would be. But I will just give a little bit of a background on sort of what we were trying to accomplish and then what we'd like to see going forward. So we've had a really fantastic partnership on this with the bare metal hosting company Packet, who've provided us an amazing amount of infrastructure for free, and we're very appreciative of that. So we're taking bare metal servers, extremely beefy ones. We run OpenStack and Kubernetes on it. We then are taking some open source networking code out of ONAP, that specifically parts of the broadband network gateway and the virtual customer premises equipment use case. And we package them up either as VNFs on virtual machines, as CNFs on containers, and run them. And the idea is to compare the throughput and the process and such where the hardware is identical. And so I think, and then we have some different use cases. I'm actually not going to go into those now. But I think one of the parts here that's most interesting, I actually put it back here in the appendix, is this question of network labs, which I draw an analogy to pets and a repeatable testbed of being more like cattle. And so one of the things that I hear a lot in the telecom industry is, oh, well, you should send that to us and we'll try it out in our lab and see if that works. And I mean, I understand where that comes from, of course, because it used to be it was physically a box that you would send. But unfortunately, it makes it much, much more difficult to reach consensus on anything because everybody's lab is slightly different and there's all sorts of parameters and other things that can go wrong. And since modern networking is essentially all software, it should be checked into source control and be replicatable. And so really one of the magics of the testbed, and it's been incredibly challenging. I mean, there's just all sorts of bugs and corner cases and upstream dependencies that change and like just dozens and dozens of things that have gone wrong over time or been much harder than we expected them to be. But the great at the end of it, we really do have replicatable installs that anyone can take, and you just get an API key from Packet. They're happy to give it to you for free for at least a couple months, and you can then exactly replicate our use case. Or even more valuably, you could swap out the network functions that we're using and put in your own. And you don't, it's all open source code under Apache 2.0. You don't need to share the results back with us. We certainly would appreciate if you would share the output back to us. And then to the degree that the networking code you want to test is open source, then we would love for you to have an upstream implementation of it that other people could look at as well. And so I do just want to mention that I think a lot of our effort here was really inspired by Kubernetes, the Kubernetes project's investment into CI, where every pull request, as most of you are aware, runs this huge automated test suite. On any given weekday, we're running 10,000 continuous integration jobs. And then every 2 days, we run a new scalability test of 150,000 containers across 5,000 virtual machines. And I think people have seen that Google provided a $9 million grant last summer to cover the next 3 years of this testing. And so the CNF testbed isn't remotely at that scale and never should be. But one of the sort of aspirations for this group, or let me just say sort of one of the weaknesses of the CNF testbed right now is that the high performance networking that we're doing, which is using VPP, is actually getting configured out of line. It's not using the model that we would recommend that anyone use in production. And so Ed Warnicki and Network Service Mesh say that they have an approach to dynamically configure that and have it essentially be run through the Kubernetes cluster without needing this out-of-line form of installation and automation. And what's great is that we don't need to argue about it and send block diagrams back and forth and send slides back and forth. When it gets mature, they should be able to submit a pull request that actually shows it working, and ideally working as well as the manual configuration piece. And the same thing for DANM or for Multis. And that's just one sort of minor question. But I think our hope or our aspiration for this group is that as we're talking about different use cases and different approaches, that we could try and get out of the kind of arguing from first principles and to a large degree actually try and argue via pull request and talk about different approaches. And then I think the message from most open source projects is that the answer is very rarely, oh, this approach is right and this one's wrong, but that there are things that you can learn and that we could evolve together. So I think those were actually the main areas that I wanted to cover. We do have some slides in here from Ericsson. I'm happy to give them maybe 5 minutes if they wanted to chat about these, but I guess I'd like to keep it relatively short, but the slides are available for everyone else. I think most of the areas that you're looking at are pretty fit well with some of the other places that I've talked about. And then I think we should probably try and move to what some of the first work areas are. I'm happy to do a 5 minute. Yeah, come on up.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
And here you go. Thank you.
So the idea was, I think we first spoke to Dan about the Telco User Group a couple of weeks ago on the Open Networking Summit, and I think we immediately started thinking about, okay, what is the thing that makes telco special, and how could we cater for those things that make telco special, even though we do develop cloud-native environments and do develop cloud-native applications. So, and I think, yeah. So I think I just put up this slide because I believe this is one of the most important one. We see that when it comes to telco, it's not about I pick a technology, I build a full stack, and I fully control it. It's typically a telecom operator who buys software, builds a cloud stack, and sources applications to run on top, and these needs to be packaged so that when the vendor provides these to the telecom operator, they can all fit together in a multi-vendor environment. So in our slides, we are trying to look at the aspect of if there is an operator who would like to run a full stack, but parts of that full stack are coming from different players. The cloud infrastructure comes from a cloud infrastructure vendor, VNFs come from VNF vendors. What are those basic building blocks that the operator sources, buys, and then will operate? And therefore, we try to sort of map the complete stack into different layers and try to show, where do we draw these lines about, here's the interface for multi-vendor interoperability. When it comes to cloud native, we believe it's extremely important to define a compatibility layer of Kubernetes that allows us to run our applications the best possible way. And we see the value to have a very thin layer of container as a service based on Kubernetes with a minimum number of few additions that allow us to run the telco use cases, but at the same time trying to keep that layer thin and agile and fast, and then put the added value either in form of a business logic or CNCF components or other open source pieces of software packaged into the application so that the platform that we rely on can be easily get from whatever vendor the operator chooses to pick the platform from, or they can actually easily build it using upstream open source pieces of software. So one of the ideas is looking at how could we create a sort of a standard for this thin container as a service layer using Kubernetes, Helm, a couple of standard CNIs. I think Dan mentioned the Dan-M and the Multus, and a couple of other things which might be necessary to provide packet throughput for those applications like 5G core and the user plane part of it. Then you will see some information about how do we believe cloud-native applications, CNFs, should be built. This is input to the discussion, and I think this is input to the discussion Dan talked about on how do we brand these CNFs and what is the goal CNF, basically, that everybody should be shooting for. And also, I think I'm really looking forward to the discussion on if there is a silver VNF, I think we should really have a mutual discussion between vendors and operators. What is the level of cloud nativeness that provides value in the telecom context? What is the minimum viable CNF? And I think we should concentrate on that. And then, of course, try to define what is the the best possible CNF that one could ever get. And last but not least, I think we see in the industry that many of the automation tasks are moved down the stack. I have seen myself a couple of presentations in KubeCon about how stateful applications are managed by operators. We really see that this is the future. So in the VNF world, we usually do automation via specific VNF managers and complex logic running above the application and the platform. Now we can package these logics and push it down to the Kubernetes layer. So I think we should discuss about what are the functions, what are the capabilities for automation that are pushed down to this layer. And we see lifecycle management for application first and foremost. And that, of course, includes lifecycle management for stateful and stateless bits and pieces of our telecom applications. So, very quick summary of things, and you will find these slides in the material with also suggestions on the way forward and where should we start if we decide to go for these things. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So I think maybe for our first couple comments, I hope everybody's not just going to be silent now, but I would love to actually hear from some telecom operators since if they're not interested in this area, that it doesn't really make sense for the rest of us to pursue it. And either positive or negative, where it's totally fine if you want to get up and say, oh, this is just a pipe dream and this is never going to be solid enough to install in your network, or oh, we're already doing this, there's nothing new or interesting here. So can I have some volunteers from the audience of some of the operators that you might want to share your opinions, and particularly on if we're not on either of those extremes, then what are the things over the next few months that would be most valuable for you? Oh, I see him. Yeah. And yeah, thank you.
Daniel Bernier, Bell Canada. I like the initiatives, hence why I'm here. The one thing I would like to probably we could start with was the problem statement. It's cool to show shiny new tools of doing things, but why do you want to go there? Might be good to have the users, the telecom users, explain why we want to look at this as an alternative. Same as why we thought we were going to go to VNFs when it kind of ended up as it is right now. So not doing the same mistake. Why do we want to go to cloud native? Why do we expect cloud native can help us so that actually we focus on trying to fix those rather than just shining new tools and every new software and thinking that's going to solve the problem, which in the end, 5 years later, doesn't solve the problem. So I think that would be an interesting thing.
Sorry, I'm not going to respond to every comment. I mean, it is not appropriate, but I didn't show this slide before. But I should just say that my impression is that telecom operators are interested in cloud native for essentially the same reasons that enterprises are. And that the three biggest benefits, there's definitely cost savings in terms of being able to run the same workloads on a smaller number of machines through more effective bin packing. In reality, what winds up happening is you come up with new workloads that you can run instead. Improved resiliency, so to failures at any level. But by far the most important reason we think people are interested in is, actually, could you pass the microphone down that way? Oh, he has it, forget it. Is the higher development velocity, where rather than trying to do quarterly updates to the network, to try and get into a pattern where you can be doing weekly or daily, or what many enterprises aim for, which is dozens of changes per day, and have the confidence to roll those out and have them evolve without losing resiliency and network quality. And these are, again, pretty high level.
Yes, this is Rabi from Vodafone.
Sorry, from Vodafone, great.
Thank you for the initiative. Of course, this is a very important initiative for us to discuss those requirements and so on. And I think I agree with you when you mentioned the goal CNF, and I think it's important for us as a community here to try to define what does the end goal look like, and what are the principles that we need to have in this cloud native transformation we're going through. And by defining those principles, that's important for all of us. This is kind of where we start to look at what transition we need to include to make sure we are ending up into the end goal we define. And the other part I would say is, you mentioned a lot about the CNFs aspect of the deployments, and also it's important to understand and cover the aspect of the infrastructure. So talking about the platform's possibilities to allow those CNFs to be deployed on top of that, and what kind of configurations do we expect from that platform, and I think is important, as well as trying to look at how CNF is being designed and architected. Because that dependency between the CNF and what infrastructure capabilities you will have is important to be clear and definitive to drive that vision of having a cloud-native deployment in the future.
Any thoughts on that? Or also, who are you?
Hi, I'm Taylor. I'm Taylor Carpenter with Vulk Cooperative, and I'm lead on the CNF testbed. So we started that like a year ago, actually. So I agree. You have to do work on both the infrastructure side as well as the network, whatever's running on there. I think that's the same thing as the application side. If we have cloud native is really about the methodologies and trying to follow those. And if you don't build the application following those, then you could have just, you know, a large legacy monolith running in a container. And even if the infrastructure makes it easier, the application could die. And you could make microservices and do everything you're supposed to from an application side. And if the infrastructure doesn't support it, maybe you have enough people to try to duct tape stuff into the infrastructure to make it work, but you don't want to do that. What you want is to build the infrastructure to support the same thing. So not only do we need cloud native network functions, we need cloud native networking, network services. That's what NSM is about. And we need to be able to think about it from infrastructure up, how to configure the switches, all the way up through the applications running.
Mark, yeah, could he?
Mark Shuttleworth, Canonical Ubuntu. First, let me just say, I think this feels like the future, right? This brings together a bunch of very tasteful things for telcos. So preliminary as it is, I do think this is how things will go. Coming from the virtualization side of the house and the experiences that we've gained working with telcos in virtualization, the relationship between workloads and hardware, I think proved to be particularly important and particularly tricky. And so I just wanted to extend an invitation to folks who are coming from the hardware side to get together early and collaborate with folks on the application side in terms of how we connect the dots. I think the performance story for containerization is very, very clear. I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. From an operational point of view, if you think of the long-term behavior of infrastructure, you're never in a position where your entire national or multinational fabric, grid, infrastructure is homogeneous. Everything is changing, and that change essentially gets rolled out in waves. Getting that right, and making sure that you preserve these fantastic characteristics, operating characteristics of iteration and speed in a world where the underlying infrastructure is changing at the pace that it does in telco. I think that's going to be a particularly unique set of challenges.
Please. Nancy? Sorry. Could you just grab that microphone right here?
Okay. I used to be at Cisco Systems, and now I am in a small company called Ludse, but I've been on the infrastructure side, and I've seen the evolution from physical to VMs, and one of the biggest things was performance. So, you try to make it a virtualized thing, but then SRIOV, and you're stuck to the hardware, so you can't actually move, and you're so cognizant of the hardware. It kind of, it makes cloud a mood thing. Like, why did I even move to the cloud? Because I'm so tied to the hardware. I think with containerization, it's going to be even bigger. So one of the things I would suggest for telco is how to address performance issues. And not converting from VM to container, and how not to rely on these SRIOV kind of things, or in some way better approaches. That would be move the journey a lot faster. That's my 2 cents.
Do you want to turn off the power piece of it?
So I'm Erez from Mellanox. 2 things. First, to the points about hardware and acceleration and cloud. I think there's already some work started in the virtualization world to provide SDN and hardware acceleration together, the OVS offloads and other virtual switches and router offloads, and we're definitely looking into driving that into a cloud native as well. This is, I think, the direction that the industry will go, where we provide virtualization and SDN and services-oriented networking, but with hardware acceleration. So this is one thing. The other thing, and this is, I think, for this group, one of the challenges that we see very early in the CNCF in general is that this community is not about what we are talking here at all. And if you look at the SIG networking, the capabilities of driving advanced networking is almost not on their plate at all. There needs to be a different team that was put together. And I think one of the main things that we will need to do is evangelize those use cases and the requirement as this user group to drive more understanding of bare metal servers that needs to run advanced networking and not only cloud, public cloud solutions. Because without that, we can speak and define use cases, but without having the SIG networking part of this effort, it will be very difficult to standardize anything. So I would like to ask everybody to help promote the need for advanced networking or advanced telco use cases. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult.
Here you go.
Hi, Frank Starsky, Red Hat. So this is not the first effort to represent telco user use cases, do analysis and derive requirements from that. We had the effort started with CNF, obviously, and then we had the Telecom User Group in the OpenStack community, and then OpenFE, etc. And all of these efforts had a rather moderate impact, I would say, right? How can we avoid repeating some of the anti-patterns we learned from these efforts? For example, throwing requirements over the fence without taking care that there's actually somebody on the other side to catch them, specifying requirements in a way that they don't cleanly separate the what from the how, and suggest a certain way of implementing, picking a specific technology, declaring them king, thinking that telco is special when you look into the financial services, the high-performance computing, the media industry, and others that have exactly the same requirements, right? And so how can we ensure that from just the way we set up this community?
So I'm not going to respond fully to that, but I do just want to say that for the 3.5-year history of CNCF, I've reiterated that our goal is not to replicate the mistakes of previous organizations, that we want to go make entirely new mistakes. And so I do appreciate that emphasis, and I hope on the mailing list and in the work group going forward, I know that essentially all of you have participated in either standards efforts or open source development or closed source cross-company development and have seen a lot of things that haven't worked. And our hope here is that by sort of coming later, we can stand on the shoulders of giants. I think we had thank you.
So Samuel Manam from Vodafone. I quite like the initiative and I'm happy with what we've listed so far, but I think what is missing for me is the security aspect of whatever we're trying to do here. Because if you look at the way we handle security in a traditional way we run VNF, we're moving towards a cloud native pattern. How do we make sure that we work, especially with the vendors and the software vendors, to build security in from day one? We need to do that, else we will not be able to be efficient in the way we develop and build our platforms going forward.
Yeah, Thomas Morin, Orange.
Stand up. And who are you?
Thomas Morin, Orange. This initiative is very important. So to answer give some answer to a comment by a previous speaker, we think it's important to start small and very practical. Well, it's easier said than done, but among the components we've identified as important for telco that are part of why telco workloads are specific is needs for having multiple interfaces in containers. So Multus is one of the pieces that is one of the practical pieces that we need to land upstream and be usable in a context like the CNF testbed. And having access to SREOV in containers is another such component that is important for telco workloads.
I just want to say on that, on the CNF testbed, we're trying to have examples of using the different technology. We've been working with Intel. We get access to the reference platform code that's open source to show Multus and other things. We're ideally show a lot of different options. You can download it, try it out. We'll be showing how you can have a pod in Kubernetes talk to a VM in OpenStack very soon. Potentially we'll have the VM using SRV, so open for pull request and any ideas for use cases as well.
Hi, this is Jonas Honinen from Nokia. The kind of like listening to the conversation and the slides and so on, I think that it becomes quite evident that there is enough ground to work on together and people have some things already in mind what they would like to bring here into this discussion. And I think also that what Frank said before, we have to be careful that we don't repeat quite the same mistakes that we did before and do what Dan said, it's basically do new mistakes instead. And I think that we have enough kind of like experience as a community, as a telco community, that we should bring here and for the working together and to avoid some of those pitfalls. But look at the things that we think with the rest of the community that might need to be changed and not change anything more than that. So try to avoid that it doesn't come a kind of like a pot of all requirements that you can find, rather look at the kind of like intersection of requirements than the union of the requirements. Thank you.
So there's a question here. So in terms of,
Name?
Yeah, could you stand up and who are you?
So I was just want to touch the base upon the security aspect on the, there's a new requirement that actually coming up in the new set of architecture for 4G and 5G is the service chaining mechanism that runs on top of virtual network functions. And then there is a, so since we basically deploy a lot of projects behind the internet environment where there is no internet available in the carrier networks, so how do we basically ensure that the protocols which are actually currently being used specifically in the telco domain is being integrated in the CNCF projects with regards to the virtual packet core and the protocols being mentioned like SCTP and things like that. So we want to basically ensure that the use case that we are planning right now is going to be supported in the next work items that we are planning for 6 months down the line. This might need to be supported in the CNCF testbed as well. So we can test those things and then performance activity as well.
So yeah, Ed may be able to help on this too. On the CNF testbed, we are collaborating with other groups that have access to different hardware, but it's mainly on Packet. And Packet does have facilities with mobile connectivity that we can go right in. That doesn't mean we're going to be able to match anything in a lab at a telco, but it'll help with that. And then within a SIM, there's a lot of telcos that are also working on use cases, so we're collaborating, passing those back and forth. I'd say we probably will end up at a point where we want to add some stuff to do on-premise deploys and then help with that. I've been talking a lot with the cluster API side of Kubernetes lifecycle about the on-prem installs, and they're interested in the network configuration that we've been doing in the testbed. So if you have something where you really want to test, I mean, I'd love to get people involved to say, we can do everything up to this point in our lab and try to figure out how that would work and make it available. So you could plug in the pieces needed for that.
Sorry, just before Ed, I do just want to mention again, we're extremely appreciative of Packet for making this hardware available, and I do think it's really appealing that others can just get an API key and exactly replicate it. But we would also be thrilled to accept pull requests to have the testbed run on other bare metal hosting providers or other VM-based hosting providers or in labs. And all we would ask is just that we collaborate to try and make it as generalizable as possible, whether that's through cluster API or other mechanisms. But we just think the more likely it is that other people can replicate your work, the more valuable it will be.
Just a follow-up question as well. So you mentioned that this group will not do a development, right? So are we actually planning the work item from this group is going to be funneling into the main CNCF projects for development? How are we planning the development for the work items that will be decided here?
So the CNF testbed is one initiative, and I would say there's going to be a lot of things that's more generalized and trying to show stuff that may be utilized in a lot of different projects. We work closely with FDIO for VPP. We have people on the CSET testing. We're also working a lot with NSM. If there's something more specific, OPNFV, Multis, trying to bring that in, probably have Dan M on that. If it becomes more specific, if you're talking about potentially the network composition, how do you make those connections and stuff, this is kind of networks, service mesh terminology. But that may be something where we say, that should be pushed over there. These are features we want in there. They care about maybe adding an agent that can do SRV as an option for your container that comes up and says, I need that. And then we'd push it over there. And if it's a generalized case, let's pull it back and make it easy for anyone to install anywhere in the test bed. But the tug will be pushing stuff out to a lot of wherever it's appropriate.
So I wanted to offer a little bit of advice in all of this. I've been doing open source networking for a long time. Probably a lot of you have seen me in a lot of places in that area. I've also been participating in CNCF projects for the last couple of years, and also watching and noting what happens when people bring requirements to Kubernetes SIGs. And that, watching what happens to requirements when they come to SIGs has been super instructive. Kubernetes in Cloud Native is a fundamentally different way of thinking about the world. The benefits that you want come from that shift in thinking. When you go to bring requirements to Kubernetes SIGs, take the time to understand how they think and try and transform your requirements into things that make sense in that mental model. Those people who do so tend to be successful in getting their needs met. People who bring requirements and try and project the thinking of the past into those SIGs tend to be politely ignored. Your needs are important. Please take the time to make sure that you're successful.
I'm just going to tell a quick story in that context. So Kubernetes is now often described as the Linux of the cloud. But in my previous go-around working with the Linux Foundation, I helped merge together its two predecessor organizations, the Open Source Development Lab and the Free Standards Group, to create the Linux Foundation in 2006. And there was an initiative at the time called Carrier Grade Linux. And it was not the official policy of OSDL, but as I arrived and got involved, I understood that there was one person who had been telling vendors that if they joined as a platinum member of OSDL, which at the time was $1 million a year, that that person could ensure that their kernel patches would get accepted. And so I really just want to reassure you all, or maybe disabuse you all, that in no way, in any form, are we trying to say, oh, if you just put it in a requirements document, even if it becomes an official output document of the Telecom User Group, that means that the upstream group, whether it's SIG-Node or API or Cluster Lifecycle or anything else, or any of the other CNCF projects, will necessarily accommodate that. What I can offer is basically a guarantee of a two-way interaction, where I'm quite confident that nearly all of the developers of the upstream projects are extremely interested in speaking with end users and looking at new use cases and understanding how those can be accommodated. But I think Ed's underlying point that it is a back and forth, and there also is a kind of a language synchronization issue is a really important one.
So another quick follow-up to Ed's point. I think this is super important to really draw some red lines very early on what kind of legacy you support. This is why I really didn't like the bronze CNF slide in there. Because we saw it on the OpenStack side, right? When there were requirements to support certain legacy workloads of the old thinking that led to an enormous amount of effort in OpenStack to add features that made a cloud platform look more like a virtualization platform of the old days, right? And that led to architecture upload and technical debt, etc. And really, we have a chance here to do it better this time. But in order to do so, you have to be very clear from the very beginning and not, yeah, let's keep it in mind while we go.
So, one more comment I want to add to this, actually, is I think complementary what has been discussed so far. I think one of the reasons why other initiatives...
Sorry, could you stand up?
Yeah. So just my comment is about the principles here. So one of the reasons in my view is why other initiatives has failed, because there's no clear principles setting those requirements that we need to build. And I'm not saying the word requirement that we need to push very specific requirements to those projects, but at least we need to agree on some principles how we need the end goal to look like. And when we talk questions about SRIOV versus multiple interfaces, this could be the principles that we're happy to live by, but there could also be just a way to get to the end goal that we'd like to see a full cloud-native deployment that has zero dependency on any underlying hardware. I think one of the most important things in my view is setting the principles and the fundamentals early on, and we be very clear into any technologies we choose. Maybe it could be the end goal, or it could be just a way to transition to where we need to go. And this is really important for us, I think.
So just some background, I guess I'd say. So I've been in container space since, like, at least the Linux container space since literally the very beginning. I'm Frederick. I'm part of the network.
And sorry, but before you keep going, I do need to credit you with most of the underlying idea of the bronze and gold. Not to blame you for it. You had a different name for it, but I do want to say for all of these slides that this is not, no one's claiming that this is original thinking. We are collaborating with a lot of folks now.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So first, I want to tell a quick thing. So this is looking at the Docker and container space and then seeing Kubernetes when it first came out. So Kubernetes has been primarily focused on the enterprise space. And so one of the things that I've noticed is, like, when telcos have come up to network SIG and so on, it's always been, okay, we have all these requirements. Kubernetes will change for us. And it says, yes, you have a lot of money, you have a lot of background, you have a lot of technical experience, but and yes, your companies are huge, but when you look at the overall size of the enterprise space, it's absolutely massive and much dwarfs all the telcos combined. And so this is part of the reason why Kubernetes has some resistance to changing. So I want to make sure that this is, like, the reason why it is clear is because I want to keep the use cases and the technology simple for the most common use case, which is not telco in this scenario. So we have to take it on ourselves to work out how to adapt to that environment. The second thing as well is to bring up what Frank's part is, like, we don't want to introduce all this bloat. So Kubernetes acting like this will actually help us with some of this. We also have to realize that if we go with, like, the bronze CNF that we have here, one of the risks, and I literally just thought this when you said this, is that one of the risks of being a bronze CNF is that things will change. And as they change, if you're tightly coupled to old ways and ways that are brittle, you are going to break. You're going to spend a lot of money and a lot of time fixing those things, recertifying and so on as things continue to change. And if you are a gold CNF, ideally, those changes should have less impact because you're following best practices. So I think one of the goals of this should be to make sure that if you hit a gold CNF, that those impacts should also be minimized on you as well.
Again, Daniel Bernier. I like almost everybody's comments. Just one thing I have to say is that I really like the approach of Ed, and sometimes Frank's as well, is that if we do the move to a cloud native, we need to change the way our applications are built. But the challenge we have as well is that, think about this, an enterprise fails something, the enterprise may offer a service. If we fail something, it's 911 that goes down. There's a problem, inherent problem of this, which is really hard for a lot of people to grasp, but when that happens, even though we decided it was going to be cloud native or VNF, the impact is really, really stressful. So the challenge for us is moving to those kind of, we don't need to, the requirement for multiple interface of Maltus is just a small problem in the overall ocean. The trouble is the blast radius of what happens if we do some kind of a drastic change like this. And this is why we really need to think about the day we move to cloud native, leverage the best practices of what we can do with cloud native to make those functions, which are so critical, be less of a pain point, and like you touch it with the red button, and you run because you want to be the guy that goes on vacation when you make that change. That's kind of trouble we want to avoid when we make that shift.
Could you pass it forward, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Callum Loud, Metaswitch. I really like the initiative and I want to echo what people have just been saying. And for me, if we want to take advantage of cloud native, we don't just need to look at the kind of the technology and the architecture and the networking. Important as they are, we have to solve those. But also we need to look at the cloud native kind of operational mindset and practices. So, we as vendors can produce, these wonderful gold standard VNFs and all that. if operators are set up so that they, can only take one major release every 9 months and test it for 6 months before it goes into production, we're not going to get the developer velocity improvements, which is you've correctly identified as the #1 thing. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's been going on in the cloud native world. It's not about the underlying technologies, but it's about how we deploy and operate that I would really like to see this group start thinking about. Just for example, CI/CD. We all know how that works in the standard. I'm a shop running on a web e-commerce shop. How might it work in a telco? We've got multi-vendors, delivering in. Maybe that's an area that the CNF testbed could perhaps evolve into, sort of look at what best practices might work there. But I think we need to look beyond the technology to the operation side as well.
I think that is one of the main goals for us, is to take that mindset and show a lot of how that works. There's some of it that should be pushed out into how the capabilities in building out the infrastructure. So if you're looking at enterprise and everyone says, okay, you can use AWS or Azure or whatever you want to use and build out most of it, you don't have to think about it. And then for the, not just telcos, but everyone that needs to deal with the lower level of networking and any other infrastructure, you need the same type of capabilities. Projects like Network Service Mesh are trying to take that same mindset so that you can think about how you would implement it. One of the things that's going to happen beyond what we're testing, and we will be showing that sort of thing in the CNF testbed, but one thing beyond that is going to be with, I think, vendors trying to get people to have APIs and stuff on any devices that we can tie in. Mellanox is trying to make stuff capable, talking about smart NICs and stuff so that we could say NSM can talk to that. You're going to push something into the smart NIC to do higher performance for the SDN, but you want that type of interface to be capable across any vendor as much as possible. And the more that we do that mindset everywhere, it'll make it more resilient, and there'll be less fear, which was one of the things that we're talking about.
Hi, Johan Svan from Ericsson, and I think this might be an area where we sort of maybe kind of special in telecom. That, I mean, we're in software sales. We sell our software and export that to an operator that deploys it and operates it and deploys their services on top of it. And we have to care about things like applying for export licenses for our software. And how do we do that while still enabling sort of the values of CI/CD and DevOps? And I think this may be a forum where we can sort of collaborate around solving some of those problems. And I think that would be really interesting to get into.
Herbert Damke, Deutsche Telekom. That's maybe really the point where we are different from the end users we have seen here on the conference. They all have dev and ops, and you're using the cloud native infrastructure to accelerate that. We have dev on the vendor side and ops on the operator side. Mm-hmm. And there is currently no model, and selling software is not a model which is fitting to gold CNFs. And finding their new model and how to work together is maybe much more important than solving technical problems.
So I think it's just timing that all of these industries are moving forward on that. Everyone was split, so it's not. Enterprise was in the same position that you're talking about. If you go back, it still is in some areas. So just trying to break those silos and get everyone to think this domain is important for me to understand so that the overall platform works well together.
So I think I would probably suggest we have 15 minutes left that I would love to try and focus in, and you're welcome to speak as well. I think one way of looking at it is particularly for the operators and the telecom vendors, what is the output of this user group that would be most useful to you internally in terms of getting the resources that you need, in terms of justifying this as an industry effort and as a reasonable thing to pursue in terms of common language and such. And then to Ed's point about throwing requirements over the wall, even better than saying, oh, well, here's the document that I really need, would also be folks stepping up and offering that they were interested in being an editor of that document or a process within it. And I think there's a lot of flexibility in terms of exactly how we organize this. We can have subgroups, we can have multiple documents and such. But I would love to see if there's some consensus on at least the lowest hanging fruit, the first couple things that we might want to focus on. But before we do that, I did want to...
Yeah, it's Harish Kaskani again from Lutze. So one thing we've talked about is not to make the same mistakes. But, OPNFV had its issues. But I also want to talk about what can we inherit, the good parts. Like yes. OPNFV, I know there are a lot of these benchmarking tools, NFV Bench, and can we just, if there are some changes, I doubt if it needs those changes because it's a benchmarking tool. Can we just inherit, and if it needs conversions to containers world, maybe we need to take that on and things like that.
Definitely.
I just wanted to point that out.
And we're using that today, are we not?
Yeah, we use NFV Bench right now.
Yeah. And so I do want to emphasize that we have no interest in recreating, if in any way possible, all the great work that's been done already.
We use T-Rex for the packet generation, and we have folks from those communities engaged on this. So.
Okay, so now that we have the volunteer for asking for volunteers to do the work, are we going to have total quiet here, or does anyone want to suggest some specific outputs, even if you're not quite willing to sign up for them yet?
Can we volunteer people?
Even better. Yes, for Frederick. You're welcome to volunteer anyone in the room.
Okay, so with the NSM community, we'll definitely make sure we point people in this direction with the CNF testbed and these efforts. And so we have pointed some people at this before. We've helped tie people. Like we had a problem with DPDK. It's like, oh hey, who can we bring in from Intel or various other groups? And so some of the commitments, even if you think that you can't really contribute that much time, I mean, even if you just can connect somebody, like even that can be a huge thing and can unblock people. So like, don't be shy with this.
So I mean, I think in terms of in the spirit of volunteering other people, my specific ask of the NSM community ahead of you actually delivering the code and the work would be to flesh out a roadmap. And so having perhaps a README document that might even live in the CNF testbed and just say, here are our aspirations over the next 3 to 6 months, that folks can be aware of that and kind of where to engage and such, I think would be quite valuable.
I think I have a suggestion to a solution.
Oh, here's Jeff. Yeah.
We just call a snap election and elect you BDFL for the group, and then we should have a great.
Yeah, I'm happy to help in collecting requirements.
Sorry, who are you again?
Yeah, I'm Gergely Csatari, I'm working for Nokia, and I'm happy to help to collect requirements and do some administrative things like, taking notes and whatnot.
Great.
So, and I'm Tamás Zsíros, and I'm very happy to volunteer myself from Ericsson to work a little bit on the aspects of, multi-vendor interoperability. How does that apply to the Kubernetes space? And also, I really feel drawn to the gold CNFs and how do we define what is the best CNF. I'm not so much drawn to the bronze CNF or the silver one. So I think we should start with the gold and then maybe work our way backwards or just stop there and see where it goes. So I'm happy to be an editor and then a little bit pull people together for some work on a white paper.
That would be excellent. And thanks, Nancy.
Yeah, so Erez again, Mellanox. So Mellanox obviously is working upstream a lot on the various communities, OpenStack and Kubernetes. I think that is very important, so we have the foundation first. But on top of that, we will start working with Taylor and the team on the test bed. We have started the discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to drive a lot of the more advanced workloads around SRAV, SmartNIC, and different offloads. So looking forward to working together.
Since we also talked about the security aspects of the things, so since I come from a very high level of security on the interfaces in the packet core, I would love to contribute from my company side of things on the security aspects of the packet flow itself from this virtual network function side of things. So definitely want to contribute on this.
Yeah, so my name's Kate Mulhall, and I work for Intel. And my team in Ireland, we've done a lot of work on the device plugins, Multus, and other of the other plugins. So we're doing a lot of work there, and we'd be happy to work with the CNCF testbed.
Thank you.
There's a couple different collaborations going on with Intel.
Yeah.
The CPU pinning.
Yes.
But it's a good example where maybe I was naive, but I did not realize the number of things that could go wrong in terms of actually trying to reliably deliver high performance. In this publicly accessible machine.
Yeah, so CPU pinning is one of them. We've also been working on the topology manager, which as well we're planning to upstream.
So right now the CNF testbed for the out-of-band items that aren't directly in Kubernetes or OpenStack like Heat, we are using Ansible to drive most of that. The Intel container experience kit for that reference platform, it uses Ansible, so we're planning on pulling the parts out that look applicable, most applicable for general use cases. That would be like the Multus configuration, using the Intel CPU manager for CPU pinning, hopefully the topology manager for NUMA zone isolation, and we may be looking at the Nokia CPU puller as another alternative for pinning and some stuff like that. But anyone that has pieces, even if it's part of a larger thing, if you can say, this part's working and it's part of a demo or it's part of a reference platform, but this portion would be really good for multiple use cases, we'd love to see it.
And on that front, I think I might also volunteer Lucina here and you, where it would be very nice to have a bit more of a write-up right now about what is occurring in the CNF testbed that is out of band, and even just a set of bullet points and just a short explanation of why. And that's in some ways should feed up as a set of requirements to device plugin and other areas where, I mean, I think in principle, we all believe that these can be configured via Kubernetes, that they can run in pods. But I think just to have even a clear list of what work needs to get done would be very helpful.
We can put that in like a README or something right in the test bed, bullet points, and that's going to be some things that are like the infrastructure set up with packet, and then stitching together the connections, which would come in like network service mesh or something, and go on from there. I think beyond that, we're probably looking at specs that would be similar to what's accepted in the Kubernetes community. I know network service mesh has been doing that, so you can drop them right into GitHub and see, here's something, we can talk to it and move from there, and it moves through the board. It's like Kanban style. Ed, do you have something?
I think there's someone before me.
Okay, let's do that first.
Bell again. For the gold CNFs, we can participate mostly for the lifecycle configuration, observability, and installation, because at the end we're going to have to run that thing. So we can probably give them some insight of what we we'd like to participate with to see how we can actually get that into our networks.
So I would suggest in the same place you're putting down the stuff about things you know that you're doing that are going to have to change, we also start trying to catalog the things that we know are going to be problematic that aren't solved, or that we don't have line of sight to solutions for. So there's been a lot of good work done on the CPU pinning work. It's been exceptional. The topology manager is actually the smartest idea I could conceive of, given the constraints in the system right now for dealing with NUMA zones. But there are a number of places where it is well understood that it will not actually get us 100% to where we need to go. And so the more we get foresight into the problems we know are coming, the more we can plan to try and figure out ways to solve them instead of discovering them later in the cycle.
Hi, just a quick comment. We have a working setup of Vertlet and a container connected, and I could potentially help with integrating that into your test platform.
That'd be great.
Hi,
Thank you.
okay. Hi, I'm Xuan from China Mobile. I want to tell one of our concerns is that China Mobile has do a lot of test work to let the NIV architecture 3-year decoupled. But now, if we want to to add one additional layer CaaS into our NIV architecture, there will be 4 layers in here. But in order not to avoid in order not to be locked in by vendors, so we had to do a lot of test work to do it. And another thing is China Mobile has already deployed a lot of OpenStack nodes in production. So that is our concern about this one. Thanks.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sampath from NTT, and I'm already doing some testing work in the OpenStack side. So I would like to contribute to any test cases you have, especially in the CaaS engineering. Pardon me. In the sense of the destructive testing side. So I'd like to give some contribution to the CNF test, if it is acceptable. I'm not sure whether you already have it in the CNF test, but if it is not, I would like to implement it in the CNF.
So is the question on what we have on the OpenStack side?
Oh, no. My question is, do you have such kind of a CaaS engineering testing in the CNF testbed? Do you have it now, or just?
The OpenStack running on the CNF testbed?
No. I'm asking about in the Kubernetes side, like in Kubernetes.
Yes.
Do you already have the kind of a CaaS engineering, like the destructive testing scenarios in the testbed?
Well, what type of scenario? I guess I could say we have everything we're doing right now is trying to test on OpenStack and Kubernetes. There's not a lot of scenarios. We started with focusing on high performance.
Right.
ONAP has a lot of, I would say, functional use cases, but they're not going to show high performance on the data plane. So we focused on that first and getting like a baseline. So some of them are very simplistic IPv4 and IPv6 routing to get that baseline, pushing it across on bare metal between nodes. But if you have specific
Sam, there's
scenarios,
the 2 use cases that we'll talk about here. But if you grab Taylor offline, he'd love to walk through with you what we've built so far. But I would emphasize it's really just the beginning in terms of showing
if you have
performance differences.
specific scenarios, though, I'd
Right.
love to implement those, whether it's building specs that could be implemented with various things, maybe with network service mesh or pull request, ideally, if you have something.
Right, yeah, I will lay it down to you, so if anybody else is interested, we can work it on it.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
So I think I'm going to finish there with a call to action. We very much would like to have you join this mailing list And we will be posting these slides. I think most of you have mine and Cheryl's info, but you're very welcome to reach out to us, or info@cncf.io or anything else if you need help getting connected to this. But really just signing up to the mailing list as a very first step, and then we're going to have several of these work items that we can reach back out to you over the next couple weeks with our first call and then meeting in Shanghai.
Yep.
Cheryl?
Definitely recommend that you join. I can approve people. I can add you to the calendar invites so we can get collaborating straight away.
Thank you all very much for attending. This is a really extremely promising start.